Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for this opportunity, because we believe this is a very appropriate timing for doing it, particularly because the focus is on Idlib. We have been hearing it during this last few days. We are all terribly concerned. They are all ingredients that exist for a perfect storm, with potentially devastating humanitarian consequences and other consequences as well. So, first of all, a little bit of a summary of facts. I'm sure John Jing will be also able to very much to refer to some of the humanitarian aspects of it. But the UN independent and best available assessment is putting at least 2.9 million people inside the Idlib area. 2.9 million people, almost 3 million. Among them, 1 million children and 1.4 million people who have already been displaced at least once. There are listed Security Council terrorist groups, including non-Syrians, foreign fighters, those that have been making terrible things in many other places. They are also there. And there are also armed opposition groups, many of whom have been evacuated to Idlib through reconciliation agreements and are not part of the terrorist groups. The overwhelming preponderance of people in Idlib, 98.5%, are civilians. President Assad stated that restoring sovereignty and defeating terrorists remain the priority of the Syrian government. Senior government officials have further stated that retaking Idlib is the next goal. Senior Iranian and Russian officials have spoken in strong terms of their own determination to purge terrorists in Idlib. At the same time, they have indicated that, one, the government would prefer to see the so-called reconciliation agreements rather than a military action. Two, that a Russian-Turkish understanding is crucially important, and that three, that Syria does not want a confrontation with Turkey. These are Syrian government official statements we have been recording recently. Russia has been in intensive dialogue with Turkey in particular, and all eyes, as you know, today have been on what could transpire or has transpired after the presidential summit between Iran, Russia and Turkey, which has just concluded in Tehran. Meanwhile, reports suggest increased deployments of government and its affiliated forces and equipment near the Idlib de-escalation zone. Yes, this used to be and still is officially a de-escalation zone. Airstrikes and mutual artillery shelling have been reported on its perimeter for the past months, resulting in deaths and injuries on both sides, with an intensification since the 4th of September. Meanwhile, the leader of what they call the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, but basically al-Nusra, let's say, call them by name, has publicly signaled the group's intention to fight. On 2nd September, photos of weaponized drones were circulated online after they landed on the Gab plain. Ostensibly the same model that the Russian Federation claims was used to carry out several attacks on the Hemin airbase in recent months. Are you hearing me now? Because I'm hearing a double voice here.
Clearly.
Yes, thank you. For their part, armed opposition groups in Idlib have reportedly been fortifying their own positions, digging tunnels and trenches and detonating bridges. Many of these armed opposition groups have in parallel pleaded, those who are not terrorist groups, publicly for the Astana guarantors to secure a non-military solution. Since early August, almost every single armed opposition group in Idlib has now come under the banner of what is called National Liberation Front. This includes various groups who have been operating under the same banner with al-Nusra in the past. If this is confirmed, and we seem to be hearing that, this can be taken as a sign of their own willingness to separate from al-Nusra. And we hope that they now take even further steps to separate themselves from listed terrorist groups. I note in this context that at the end of August, Turkey made it clear that it views Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, i.e. al-Nusra, as a terrorist organization, sending a strong signal to armed groups to separate from al-Nusra from now on. We have seen statements and counter-statements regarding potential chemical weapons use. We have seen warnings and counter-warnings about the dangers of a major assault on Idlib. And we have seen intensified military presence in the region. I've laid out to you, Madam President, all the ingredients for a perfect storm. The dangers are profound that any battle for Idlib would be a horrific and bloody battle. Civilians are its potential victims, and there are ever-present dangers in the case of a full-scale assault, of incidents or rapid escalations involving regional and international players. So let's remember that there is no Idlib after Idlib to which people can be evacuated or at least be feeling safer during a combat. There must be and is another way that all-out military escalation takes place. The Security Council cannot accept that the civilians of Idlib must face this type of fate. So, efforts to combat terrorism do not supersede obligations under international law and the moral conscience of humanity. We must put the sanctity of human civilian lives above everything else. So that's why we are urging ourselves and all stakeholders to contribute to find a formula to prevent a terrible tragedy, while at the same time allow the issue of Security Council designated terrorist groups to be addressed. The declaration issued by President Putin, Erdogan, and Rouhani states that they decided to address the situation in Idlib, and I quote, in the spirit of cooperation that characterized the Astana format. We don't have much more details on that. We would like to see what this means in practice in order to address this issue. They are the guarantors of this last escalation area and therefore have a direct influence and, frankly, responsibility on how to solve it. And I'm sure Idlib is on the top of the agenda as it was shown in the Tehran meeting. I look also to other key actors, including Gulf and many other countries who have leverage over non-terrorist armed opposition groups to do whatever they can to ensure that they put civilians first and separate from al-Nusra. I am concerned about reports that many groups, not all, have become increasingly desperate and, in some cases, ruthless. My colleague John Jing from OCHA will brief you on what must happen on the humanitarian side to protect civilians and the humanitarian response plan. But let me emphasize, people should be granted safe passage to places of their own choosing if they want to leave temporarily. We must allow the opening of a sufficient number of protected voluntary evacuation routes for civilians in any direction, east, north, and south. And for that, we must be granted access, the UN, and at a scale. The UN stands ready, me inclusive, and I'm sure all my colleagues of the humanitarian team, to work with all parties on the spot and elsewhere on the modalities and parameters for establishing and functioning any such voluntary evacuation route if it was required, with full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights principles. Let me further reiterate the Secretary General's clear position that any use of chemical weapons is totally unacceptable. As the OPCW has found, the norm against the use of chemical weapons has been repeatedly violated in Syria. This must not happen again. I cannot stress enough the danger associated with any alleged use of these weapons, not only in humanitarian terms, but also the acute threat to maintaining international peace and security. But I equally strongly underscore that the overwhelming majority of civilians have been killed in Syria by indiscriminate, or sometimes targeted attacks against civilians by conventional weapons, and these are also abhorrent and unacceptable. One last point. All this talk of an assault in which can produce a perfect storm on Idlib is happening at exactly the same time when there is a serious talk of moving on a constitutional committee and desires to urge Syrian refugees to return to the country. These narratives do not sit well one beside the other. Either we are trying to find a political way to end this war and move to a post-war political scenario, or we will see this war reach new levels of horrors. This is why today's meeting in Tehran is so important, and why I'm convening Iran, Russia, and Turkey in Geneva next Monday and Tuesday, and then on Friday, Egypt, France, Germany, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Kingdom, and the United States. It would be the ultimate failure of imagination and of diplomacy if, with these efforts, we simply saw an increase of military activities. Let me conclude with 2 points, if I may, Madam President. The first one is, I've seen today many people coming from Idlib, civilians. They are civilians representing 2.9 million people. They are women, normal doctors, farmers, people. They are almost 3 million. They have been initiating demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations. They have been having candlelights at night to show that in each of these homes there are normal people, not necessarily terrorists. There are 3 million civilians. And I've been inspired by what they've been telling me, because they've been asking us, the UN, and through you yourself, to also express their voice. In that context, if you allow me, in the private chamber, since the question of separating terrorists from others and protecting civilians and give a voice to the civilians, since I've been asked, do we have at the UN any ideas? We do some ideas, and I will take the liberty of elaborating them when we meet in a private chamber. Any idea, any proposal to avoid this becoming the biggest humanitarian tragedy at the end of the most horrible recent conflict in our memory should be at least given a chance. Thank you.